When Keanu fell, Sandra was the first to reach his side. The night was calm, the city lights shining like stars scattered on the ground, when a sound broke the silence. It was the sharp cry of brakes, the heavy thud of impact, and then the world seemed to pause. On the side of the road a figure lay still. It was Keanu Reeves. He had been crossing quietly, unnoticed, his thoughts somewhere else when the accident struck. People gasped, some froze, and others pulled out their phones. But one person did not waste a second. Sandra Bullock was there, and her first instinct was to run. She pushed through the small crowd that had started to form. Her heart raced, not because of the noise or the chaos, but because she saw a friend, someone she deeply respected, lying helpless. Her voice cut through the confusion. Call for help, now. There was strength in her tone, but inside she was trembling. She reached Keanu, knelt down beside him, and whispered, "You're not alone. I'm here." Her hands shook as she touched his shoulder, but her eyes were steady, determined. Keanu's face was pale, his breath uneven. He tried to open his eyes, and in that moment he saw her. Not the flashing lights, not the curious strangers, but only her. Sandra's presence was like a shield, blocking the noise of the world. "Hold on," she said softly, though her heart was breaking. She remembered every moment they had shared, the films, the laughter, the struggles. Now, none of that mattered as much as this moment, this fight for his life. Sirens grew louder in the distance. Help was coming, but time moved slowly. Sandra kept talking, her voice a thread pulling him toward safety. "You are strong. You are not giving up. Stay with me." The crowd watched, but they saw something rare. This was not Hollywood, not a scene written on paper. This was real, raw, filled with pain and hope. When the ambulance finally arrived, the medics rushed in, but even then, Sandra did not let go of his hand. She walked beside the stretcher, refusing to leave. One medic asked her to step back, but she shook her head. "He needs someone who knows him. I will stay." There was no hesitation, only loyalty. As the vehicle doors closed, Sandra climbed in. She sat beside Keanu, her hand still gripping his. The road blurred outside, sirens wailed, but inside that ambulance was a quiet promise. She would not let him fight this battle alone. Keanu tried to speak, but his voice was broken, weak. Still, a single word escaped his lips. Why? It was not about the accident. It was about her choice to stay, to risk herself, to put his pain before her own. Sandra leaned close and answered, "Because you have always stood for kindness, and now kindness stands for you." Her words carried both strength and sorrow, and in that instant, something deep passed between them. The hospital doors opened wide, lights harsh and cold. Doctors took over, questions filled the air, but Sandra remained. She waited in the corridor, her hands clasped, her mind racing through memories. She thought about their years of friendship, about the respect that had grown like roots under the surface. She realized then that this moment was not just about an accident. It was about what people mean to each other when life is stripped down to its core. Hours felt like days. Finally, a doctor approached. His face was serious, but his words carried a fragile hope. "He is stable but weak. The next hours will decide everything." Sandra closed her eyes, breathed deeply, and nodded. She walked to his room, and as she entered, she saw him lying there, fragile yet still filled with quiet dignity. She pulled a chair close, took his hand again, and whispered, "I will not leave." And in that quiet hospital room, under the weight of fear and the light of fragile hope, their story began to change. The silence inside the hospital, the night outside the hospital was loud with city sounds, but inside the walls everything felt heavy and quiet. Sandra sat beside Keanu's bed, the machines around him humming softly. Every beep, every flicker of light was a reminder of how fragile life could be. She held his hand, firm but gentle, as if her touch could keep him grounded. Hours passed, but she did not move. Sometimes she whispered his name. Sometimes she spoke about simple things, the way the sky had looked earlier, the sound of rain she once remembered during a long filming day, or the funny mistakes they had laughed at on set. She wanted to remind him of life, of little moments that made the world worth staying in. But deep inside her heart was a storm. She asked herself over and over, why him? Why now? Keanu was always the one who gave quietly, who showed kindness without expecting anything back. He had carried his own pain silently for years, yet never let it make him bitter. And now, when he deserved peace, fate had struck him down. It felt unfair, almost cruel. The door opened and a nurse stepped in to check his vitals. She looked at Sandra and whispered, "He's stable, but weak. Talk to him, it helps." Sandra nodded, though she already knew she would never stop talking to him. She leaned closer, her voice soft. "Do you remember when we were both nervous before our first big scene together? You told me, 'Don't think about fear, think about truth.' That moment stayed with me. You always chose truth over fear. Now I ask you, please choose life over pain." Her words trembled, but her eyes stayed strong. Then something small but powerful happened. Keanu's fingers twitched against hers. It was barely a movement, almost like the whisper of a thought, but it was there. Sandra froze, her breath caught, then tears filled her eyes. She pressed his hand closer and whispered, "You hear me? I know you do. Don't stop fighting." Yet the fight was not only his. Sandra began to feel the weight of loneliness pressing on her shoulders. People outside the room carried on with their lives, but she was locked inside this moment, carrying fear that would not leave. She realized how often Keanu had carried his own burdens alone. She thought of the stories he never fully shared, the silent grief behind his smile. And now she was beginning to understand what it meant to stand by someone without walking away. Morning light slowly touched the edge of the curtains, and for the first time, Sandra stood. She walked to the window, staring at the rising sun. It felt like the world was moving forward while her world had stopped. Yet that small twitch of his hand reminded her of resilience. Even broken, even weak, Keanu was still reaching for life. A doctor entered and spoke carefully. "We need to keep him under observation. There may be hidden injuries. This could take time." Sandra nodded, her voice steady. "Time is something I will give him. I'm not leaving." When the doctor left, Sandra sat again and whispered, "You once told me that pain passes, but kindness stays. Today, I give you mine. I will not let you go through this alone." And though the machine still hummed, and though Keanu's eyes were closed, the room felt different. It was no longer only filled with fear. It carried a quiet promise of hope, of loyalty, of a bond stronger than the silence of pain. The weight of waiting, the hospital had its own rhythm, one that felt endless. Footsteps in the corridor, the distant sound of stretchers rolling, the low hum of voices. But for Sandra, the only rhythm that mattered was the steady, fragile beep of the machine beside Keanu's bed. She watched it like a lifeline, afraid of what silence might mean. Waiting was harder than she expected. Hours stretched into days, and every day carried the same question. Would he wake up stronger, or would he slip further away? She spoke to him constantly, refusing to believe her words went unheard. "You once said the world needs gentle souls, even when the world is not gentle back. You are one of those souls. I will not let you fade." Her devotion did not go unnoticed. Nurses whispered about her in the hallway, touched by how she never left his side. Some wondered why she cared so deeply. Others knew this was not about fame or friendship only. It was about something more powerful, something rare. On the third night, exhaustion began to pull at her. Her eyes were heavy, her body weak, but she forced herself to stay awake. She feared that if she slept, he would slip away without her knowing. Her hands trembled as she poured herself a glass of water, when suddenly, a sound behind her made her turn. It was Keanu. His voice was faint, barely there, but he whispered a word that shattered the silence. "Sandra!" Her glass nearly fell from her hand. She rushed to his side, her eyes wide with hope and fear. "I'm here," she said quickly, leaning close. "I never left." His eyes opened, slow and heavy but real. For the first time since the accident, she saw his gaze. Tired, fragile, but alive. Tears filled her eyes as she whispered, "You're back. You're really back." Keanu struggled to form words. His lips trembled as he asked, Why are you still here?" She smiled through her tears, brushing his hair gently away from his face. "Because when someone falls, the people who care don't walk away. They reach out. You've carried so much alone, but not this time. Not while I'm here." His eyes softened, though pain still clouded them. He whispered, "I don't want to be a burden." Her voice grew firm, though her heart was breaking. "You are not a burden. Kindness is not measured by strength alone. It is measured by the courage to let others stand with you. So let me stand with you." For a moment, silence filled the room again. But this time it was not heavy. It was filled with unspoken trust. Keanu closed his eyes, not in defeat, but in fragile relief, as if her words gave him permission to rest. That night, Sandra sat beside him with a new strength. The waiting had not ended, but now there was a spark of hope. He had spoken her name. He had opened his eyes, and she knew then that resilience was alive inside him, even in his weakest hour. The fragile road forward. The first time Keanu's eyes opened fully, Sandra felt her heart skip. He was still weak, still pale, but there was life in his gaze. She leaned closer, holding his hand as if it could keep him steady. "You're safe," she whispered. "You made it through the worst." But deep inside, she knew the road ahead would not be simple. Survival was only the first step. Recovery would test him in ways he had never faced before. The doctors confirmed her fear. "His body is fragile," one explained. "Walking, even speaking for long, will take time. He needs patience and people who won't let him give up." When Sandra heard those words, she understood her role. It was not enough to save him in the moment of the fall. She had to help him rise again, even if it meant carrying her own pain quietly. Days passed, and with every sunrise, new challenges appeared. Keanu hated the weakness he felt. He had always been a man of quiet strength, someone who bore loss and hardship with dignity. Now, lying in a bed, relying on others even for the simplest things, made him restless. One morning, Sandra found him turning his face away as the nurse tried to help him sit. Frustration filled his eyes. "I don't want to be like this," he muttered. Sandra placed a hand on his arm. "Being weak for a while does not erase who you are. Strength is not never falling. It is standing back up when the world pushes you down." He looked at her, struggling between anger and sorrow. "What if I can't stand back up?" Her eyes softened. "Then I will stand beside you until you do." Her words lingered, and though he did not answer, something shifted in him. He began to try again. Each small movement, each attempt to sit, to lift his hand, became a silent battle between despair and resilience. For Sandra, watching him struggle was painful, but she refused to let him face it alone. She encouraged him with stories of their past, with laughter about mistakes, with quiet reminders of the respect people carried for him. She reminded him that the world still needed his kindness, his humility, his rare way of giving without asking for anything in return. Slowly, fragile steps were taken. He sat up without help. He whispered longer sentences. He even managed a faint smile when Sandra teased him about his stubbornness. Yet, beneath these victories, a shadow still remained. In the quiet of night, when Sandra thought he slept, Keanu whispered to himself words she was not meant to hear. "Why was I spared? What if I'm not meant for more?" Those words pierced her heart. She realized his greatest wound was not in his body but in his spirit. To help him heal, she would need more than patience. She would need to remind him of the light he had given others, the light that still lived inside him, even when he could not see it. Facing the mirror of doubt, the days in the hospital stretched into weeks. Every step forward felt small, but to Sandra it was proof that Keanu was still fighting. He could now sit without help. He could drink water on his own, and sometimes he even managed to share a faint smile. But progress did not erase the heaviness inside him. One morning, Sandra found him staring at the mirror across from his bed. His eyes were fixed on his reflection, not with pride, but with quiet pain. His face looked tired, his body weaker than he remembered. He whispered under his breath, "This is not me." Sandra walked closer, standing beside him, her reflection joining his. "What do you see?" she asked softly. "I see someone broken," he replied. "Someone who cannot even stand without help. The man people respected is gone." Her heart ached at his words. She shook her head gently. "You are not broken. You are wounded, yes, but wounds heal. What makes people respect you has nothing to do with strength in your legs or power in your hands. It is your heart that has never been broken." He turned his eyes to her, searching for truth. "But what if I fail? What if I never return to who I was?" She placed her hand over his. "Then you will become someone new. And that someone will still be enough, because you are not defined by what you lose, but by what you give." Her words lingered in the room like sunlight through the window. For a moment, Keanu's eyes softened, though doubt still rested behind them. That afternoon, a therapist entered to help him practice standing. It was the hardest moment yet. His legs shook, his arms trembled, sweat covered his face, and after a few seconds he collapsed back onto the bed. Frustration burned in his chest. He clenched his fists and muttered, "I can't." Before the therapist could respond, Sandra leaned forward. Her voice was calm but strong. "You can. Not today, maybe not tomorrow, but one day. The only way you fail is if you stop trying." He closed his eyes, ashamed of his weakness, but her words planted a seed. Later that night, when the hospital grew quiet again, Keanu whispered, "Thank you for staying." Sandra smiled faintly, her voice tender. "I'm not here because I have to be. I'm here because I want to be." Friendship is not about sharing only joy. It is about carrying the weight of each other's struggles. "And I will carry this with you." A silence filled the room, but it was no longer heavy. It was filled with trust, with the fragile beginning of hope. The climb back to strength, the first time Keanu stood on his own feet again, even if only for a few seconds, the room felt different. The nurse held one side, Sandra held the other, and together they steadied him as his legs trembled under his weight. His jaw tightened, his hands shook, but his eyes carried a fire that had been missing for weeks. When he finally sat back down, breathless, Sandra whispered, "You did it. You really did it." He shook his head, sweat dripping down his face. "I almost fell." She smiled softly. "But you didn't. That is the difference." Those small victories became their daily rhythm. Each step, each stretch, each moment he stood longer than before. Sandra never left his side. She celebrated every progress, no matter how small. And when he faltered, she reminded him that failing once was not the same as giving up. Still, the battle was not only physical. At night, when the corridors were quiet, Keanu's mind was restless. He thought about his past, the grief he carried, the losses that had marked his journey long before this accident. Sometimes he whispered into the darkness, "Maybe life is telling me to stop." Sandra always answered, even if her voice was tired. "Life is not telling you to stop. It is telling you to rise again, to show that pain cannot silence kindness." One evening, as the sun painted the sky in shades of gold, Sandra brought him outside into the hospital garden. It was his first time breathing fresh air since the accident. He looked at the flowers, the sky, the small children playing at the far end, and for a moment his eyes softened. "I forgot how beautiful the world looks when you are forced to pause." She nodded. "Sometimes we only see the value of life when we almost lose it. Maybe that is the gift hidden in the pain." He turned to her, his voice low but sincere. "You've given me more than the doctors, more than the medicine. You gave me hope when I had none." Her eyes glistened with tears, though she tried to hide them. "You gave the world hope first. I only gave back what you already gave me." Their silence after those words was not empty. It was filled with respect, with something deeper than gratitude, something unspoken yet powerful. As the days passed, Keanu's strength grew. He walked a few steps with help. He laughed quietly at small jokes. He even managed to talk with a nurse about movies, his voice carrying a shadow of the warmth people knew him for. But even in this progress, Sandra sensed something more was coming. Recovery was not just about walking again. It was about facing the fear, the pain, the hidden sorrow that lived in his heart, and she knew that moment was near. The return of light, the hospital garden, became a quiet refuge for Keanu. Every day, Sandra wheeled him outside, and little by little, he began to walk short distances on his own. But even as his body grew stronger, his spirit still wrestled with shadows. One night, when the corridors were silent and the world outside was dark, he finally confessed what had been heavy on his heart. "Sandra," he whispered, "I've lost so much in life. People I loved, chances I missed, moments I cannot get back. Sometimes I wonder if this fall was a message, telling me it is time to let go." Her chest tightened at his words, but she refused to let sorrow take the air between them. She leaned closer, her voice calm but firm. No, it was not a message to stop. It was a reminder. Life is fragile, yes, but it is also precious. Every time you rise again, you give hope to others who are afraid to rise. He looked at her, searching her eyes as if trying to believe. "But what if I am not strong enough?" She pressed his hand gently. "Strength is not about never breaking. It is about choosing to heal. And you are healing. Look at you. You are standing, walking, breathing, smiling again. You are proof that pain cannot take away the light of someone who refuses to give up." Her words struck something inside him. He remembered the faces of strangers who once came to him with gratitude for his kindness, for the way his humility had touched their lives. He remembered letters from fans who found comfort in his silence, his gentleness. And now he realized, if he gave up, he would not only lose himself, he would silence the hope he had once inspired in others. The next morning, he made a decision. When the therapist arrived, Keanu pushed himself harder than before. His steps were unsteady, his breath uneven, but he did not stop. Every time he felt his legs weaken, he remembered Sandra's words, her hand steady beside him, her eyes filled with unwavering belief. He walked across the room, slowly but completely, and when he reached the other side, tears filled his eyes. Sandra clapped softly, her face glowing with pride. "You did it. I knew you would." He sat down, breathless but smiling. "I didn't do it alone. You carried me when I could not carry myself." Weeks later, the day came when Keanu was finally discharged. As they walked out of the hospital together, the sun shone bright, almost as if the world itself was celebrating his return. Sandra stayed close, her presence as steady as it had been from the first moment of his fall. They paused outside, the city alive around them. Keanu looked at her, his voice filled with quiet gratitude. "I will never forget this. When I fell, you were the first to reach me. But more than that, you reminded me that even when life breaks us, kindness can put us back together." Sandra smiled, her eyes soft. "You don't owe me anything. You only owe yourself the chance to live fully again. That is what matters." As they stood there, surrounded by the noise of the world, there was a stillness between them. Not silence born of fear, but silence born of peace. Keanu realized that this chapter of pain had not destroyed him. It had rebuilt him, with Sandra's kindness as the foundation. And so, the man who had once lain broken on the road now walked forward again, not as the same man he had been, but as someone stronger, someone who knew that resilience was not about standing tall without falling, but about rising every time life knocked him down.